Well, welcome to another episode of Monocle Spade, and I'm your host, Ted Wright. We are very excited today to have Dr. Glen Fritz with us. I'll be introducing him in just a moment, but again, welcome to Monocle Spade Podcast, the podcast of epic archaeology, where we explore the world of the Bible and beyond through the lens of history and archaeology. Well, if you were with us last time, we had Dr. David Downing, and I made a promise to you guys that I was going to get a monocle because we are called Monocle and Spade, and so some people were saying, well, Ted, you should have a monocle. So just to let you guys know, I did order the monocle, but it has not gotten here yet. So hence the regular glasses. So, but we like the old-fashioned monocle. It's sort of as a hearkening back to the archaeology of the old days. Anyway, so I know I know your heart is broken that you haven't seen me with the monocle on, but it is coming. So stay tuned for that. But yes, we do have one really exciting episode today that is really near and dear to my own heart. Because it encompasses so many things that I am passionate about as a person, as a scholar, as a researcher, as just a person, who's interested in the Bible. And that is the route of the Exodus through the wilderness and then crossing the Red Sea, whether or not this actually happened in history. And do we have any evidence of this? And to help us today to walk through this, I have a really amazing guest. His name is Dr. Glen Fritz. You may or may not have ever heard of him. Some of you, though, probably have heard of him. If you've seen Patterns of Evidence, the documentary produced by Tim Mahoney, Dr. Fritz was featured on most recent episode of Patterns of Evidence discussing the route of the Exodus and the possible Red Sea crossing. Dr. Fritz has been involved in the study of Exodus geography since about 2000. So he's been studying this for about 20 years or so. He holds a PhD in environmental geography from Texas State University, San Marcos. In the course of investigations, Dr. Fritz has traveled to Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and also he has studied maps of the region. He noticed that older maps of this region grossly misinterpreted the Gulf of Aqaba on the eastern Sinai or either omitted it entirely. And so we're going to get into that today. But first, I just want to go ahead and welcome Glen. Welcome you, Glen, to the program. Thank you so much for coming on today to Monocle and Spade.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you again for this, and I know that people are really just going to find this absolutely captivating and exciting. And so let me just start out by saying that for many people who read the Bible, and depending on which version you have, when you're reading through the Exodus, some versions will say that the Israelites, as they, now we've already had an episode on Monocle and Spade. We actually had 2 episodes featuring the Exodus, which we're not going to go over again, but we hold at Epic Archaeology that the Exodus occurred in the early date, approximately 1446 BC, under very likely Amenhotep II. Some people debate about that, but we hold that it was very likely Amenhotep II. And then they were there in Tel el-Daba in the Nile Delta, which is the city of Avaris, the ancient city of Avaris. So when the Israelites left out of there, they left and they brought all of their people out, and they went down into the wilderness and they escaped from Pharaoh. But of course, the penultimate verse, or actually a passage that talks about this in detail, is in Exodus chapter 14, which goes into some detail about exactly where the Israelites went and what happened. And when people read their Bibles, they will read inevitably that the Israelites came to the Sea of Reeds. And so when they're reading the margin notes of some of the study Bibles, it will say that there was a marshy marsh there in the eastern Nile Delta. The Israelites, God somehow sent a wind, and the marsh sort of dried up, and the Israelites sort of went through, and they went down into Mount Sinai. But I have always had problems with that for multiple reasons, which we'll get into now, just a moment. But Glen, have you studied this concept of the Sea of Reeds, and is that kind of what got you into this, or maybe perhaps you can sort of tell us what got you interested in this subject?
Ted, I was riding on a bus in Jerusalem in 1996, and I was sitting next to a rabbi, and people on the bus were discussing where Mount Sinai was located, and there was a lot of confusion about it. And being a logical, analytic sort of person, I made a mental note that there has to be an explanation for this problem. And so I was talking to the rabbi next to me, and lo and behold, he was from San Antonio, where I was living at the time.
Cool.
And he said, well, you ought to study Hebrew and read what the Hebrew Bible says about the Exodus. And I took him up on that. I ended up studying Hebrew in the synagogues for 4 years, which greatly helped my understanding of some of the details of the geography involving the Exodus. But I didn't really start studying the actual geography till about 2000. I was tied up with other projects and sidetracked. And then I realized as I was studying that I needed good maps of the area. I needed topographical maps. I needed good satellite imagery. And this was a time when we didn't have Google Earth. We didn't have satellite imagery you could just zoom into. So I ended up going to graduate school at Texas State in geography just to learn to use satellite imagery and generate 3D maps to study the Exodus.
Very
so
cool.
that cascaded into a couple of books and 20 years of research.
Awesome. That is just fantastic. So what we'd like to do next is sort of allow Dr. Fritz to sort of bring us into this this whole realm of studying the geography. Geography is something that is really important, and that is the lay of the land. You can have physical geography, cultural geography, but what we're talking about here when we talk about the Exodus is actual physical geography and connecting names and places to actual geographical places on Earth that actually have coordinates that you can actually find on a map. And if the biblical writers, which we believe that they were telling us the truth, are accurate, then we should be able to find this information on the ground. And that is what historical geography is. One of the earliest, in fact, one of the earliest archaeologists really in early archaeology in the world was by Edward Robinson, who was an early biblical geography. He and Eli Smith went up from Beirut, Lebanon, and they traveled all throughout Palestine, and they located they were about 85 to 90% correct, and they actually located many of the places that were lost in history. And so I see sort of Dr. Fritz is sort of following in line with Eli Smith, Edward Robinson and Eli Smith, and doing some really great work in historical geography that I think his work needs to be widely known. So Glenn, if you don't mind, if you would just kind of, you can go ahead and share your screen and allow the folks to see that, and then you can just kind of walk us through the case for the Exodus route that you propose in your book.
Very good. Am I sharing?
Yes, you are good to go, and your picture's right there on the top right. So go ahead and take us away there. There you are, Indiana Jones.
Well, most of the I'm not getting my.
You can just use your arrow, I think, to advance the slide.
Yeah, I was using my space bar.
Oh, okay.
I'm not getting an advance on this.
You can try it again. It's all right, folks. You can drink a cup of coffee and talk amongst yourselves as you watch.
There we go.
There we go.
My research led me to write 2 books, and the books are fairly extensive because the topic requires a lot of detail to explain, and it's very difficult to discuss some of these Exodus topics unless people are somewhat up to speed on the general geography of the area. So the region of the Exodus is here in the Sinai Peninsula, Egypt, Arabian area, and it's about a size that would fit well within the state of Texas. So actually the whole region of the Exodus was relatively small by our US travel standards. And essentially, as Ted was saying, the Exodus began in Goshen at Tel Adaba and wound up 40 years later in Jericho on the edge of the Promised Land. And to identify some landmarks, this is the Sinai Peninsula, a triangular piece of land surrounded by the Gulf of Suez on the west and the Gulf of Aqaba on the east. These are arms or branches of the Greater Red Sea. We have Egypt and the Nile Delta and the Isthmus of Suez. Arabia is east of the Gulf of Aqaba, and within Arabia was ancient Midian, where Moses spent 40 years in exile. We have the ancient land of Etham here in the mountains of Jordan, the Dead Sea, and the location of ancient Canaan and the Mediterranean Sea. So those are the main landmarks that we're going to be looking at today. Now, in the Red Sea tradition, the sea crossing was at the head of the Gulf of Suez, and Mount Sinai was in the Sinai Peninsula. And I looked at this and I thought, well, what justifies a crossing there at the head of the Gulf of Suez, and what justifies a Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula? This particular map here is circa 1730. But now, as more people have addressed the Exodus issue, we've got at least 8 bodies of water and 15 crossing locations. We have the idea of a Red Sea and a Reed Sea. And so there's a lot of conflicting theories. Going back in history, the Greek Septuagint Bible, which was the first translation of the Hebrew Bible, substituted their term erythrithalassa, which we translate as Red Sea. They substituted that for the Hebrew Yam Suph. So every time in the Hebrew Bible that Yam Suph appears, they substituted erythrithalassa, which in English is Red Sea. That's how we get the Red Sea idea. Most Bibles will use Red Sea. They won't refer to Yam Suph. About 100 AD, the Jewish historian Josephus, writing, said that it was a 3-day journey from Egypt to the sea crossing. And so that would correlate in most people's minds with the crossing at the head of the Gulf of Suez near Egypt. And that's how we get the tradition of the Red Sea and a crossing near Egypt, which is the modern Gulf of Suez. How did the Septuagint writers get the idea of Red Sea? Well, this map shows a concept of the world at the time of Herodotus, around 400 BC. And the Red Sea was thought of as the waters to the south of Egypt and extending all the way over to the Persian Gulf. And so the Red Sea was the water to the south of Egypt. North of Egypt, the sea was the Mediterranean. And so they only had 2 seas. They had the Northern Sea and the Southern Sea. And so when the Septuagint writers were thinking about what Yam Suph could be, they decided it was the Red Sea, the sea to the south, not the Mediterranean. But as I said, the ancient Hebrew name for the Sea of the Exodus is Yam Suph. It appears 24 times in Scripture. And what we have, though, is a clash now between the Egyptian sites and the names Red Sea and Reed Sea. And I'm sorry, my PowerPoint is advancing automatically, which is driving me nuts. Because I've taken slides out of other presentations and some of them are automated, and
I see. Yeah,
I didn't
don't
take
worry.
those out. So essentially, what I discovered is that the biblical Yam Suph was the Gulf of Aqaba, east of the Sinai Peninsula. But the tradition and the Reed Sea and Red Sea ideas are at Egypt. So there's this tension in the literature and between these two locations. And I was trying to figure out why the Gulf of Aqaba was ignored when that seemed to be the site referred to in the Hebrew Bible for Yam Suph. And the problem again is that the Septuagint definition of the Red Sea is not the Hebrew definition of Yam Suph, which I'll be addressing shortly. The Hebrew definition of Yam Suph applies to the Gulf of Aqaba. So the Septuagint Red Sea was birthed a geographical problem because it excluded the Hebrew idea of Yam Suph. And the main issue in antiquity as well as now is that the Red Sea term is too generic to differentiate between the two gulfs. In other words, if I say, well, the Exodus occurred in the Red Sea, that doesn't tell you anything about the two gulfs.
Yeah.
And that same problem existed with the Greeks. When the Septuagint talked about the Red Sea, it did not differentiate or even explain that there were two gulfs. And when we read in our Bibles the Red Sea, well, that's really not an error, but it's not specific. It's too generic. It's too general to identify perhaps which arm of the Red Sea was involved in the Exodus. And so that's the problem we have with the Red Sea term in antiquity and now in our Bibles. Now, there are 7 geographical verses involving Yam Suph. 3 of them are not linked with the Exodus, and the 4 verses that are linked with the Exodus are here on the bottom. The interesting thing about the verses linked with the Exodus is 3 of them are in the 40th year of the Exodus. So how could a sea near Egypt be linked with the Exodus 40 years later? Doesn't make any sense. And so chronologically, this is an issue that most people don't address, is why why Moses is talking about Yam Suph 40 years after they're out of Egypt.
Right.
And
that's a good point.
So the verses that mention Yam Suph geographically are dealing with the Promised Land, with Mount Seir, with Etham, and they have nothing to do with Egypt. And that's geographically, that's another friction point there, besides the chronology, that these locations that mention Yam Suph have nothing to do with Egypt. So let's look at an example here. Exodus 23:31, I'll set your bounds from Yam Suph even onto the Sea of the Philistines and from the desert to the river. That was spoken to Moses, and the Lord said that the boundary ultimately of the Promised Land would be from Yam Suph to the Sea of the Philistines, which is the Mediterranean, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates River. The river here that's referred to as the Euphrates. So what we have is a verse that's using Yam Suph as the boundary of the Promised Land. And of course, that has nothing to do with Egypt. And if you move Yam Suph away from, again, I'm sorry about these slides jumping.
No worries.
Didn't realize they were automated. So the key point here is that Yam Suph marked the southern boundary, or the southern extent, the end of the Promised Land in Exodus 23:31. And the Promised Land was everything to the Hebrews, and for them to confuse Yam Suph with some other body of water somewhere else would completely remove the definition of their bounds.
Right.
Here's another example in 1 Kings 9:26. King Solomon made a navy of ships at Etzion Geber, which is beside Elat, on the shore of Yam Suph, at the land of Etham. So 3,000 years ago, King Solomon made ships at a body of water called Yam Suph. We know that Elat has always been at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. This is the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. We're looking from west to east. Etzion Geber means strong backbone, and it refers to the pass that goes through these mountains of modern Jordan now. There was one pass here, and that's what Etzion Geber refers to. But the land of Edom is also mentioned, and so this was the region of Edom. So we have these markers that strongly indicate that Yam Suph had to be in this area. Now, people will say, well, Yam Suph could have been over in Egypt too. Well, it could have been, but that wasn't in the experience of the Hebrews, of the patriarchs. And it certainly wasn't a place where Solomon built ships.
Yep, that's right.
And so when we look at the meaning of Yam Suph, Yam means sea, and you read Hebrew from right to left. Yam means sea, and Suph means end. I'm going to explain why Suph means end. But Suph does not mean reeds or papyrus, which I'll also get into. And we have to talk about the family of Suph words. In Hebrew, words fall into families, and each family develops from a root verb. In this case, Safa is the root verb of the Suph word family. Safa means to consume, to destroy, to perish. In short, it means to end in some way. Now, the idea that Yam Suph means red has been discredited by all scholars. There's 24 occurrences of Yam Suph, but Yam always means sea, but Suph never means red. So we can discard those verses as a meaning in this Suph word family. Now, in this Suph family, I've got 101 words listed here, examples listed here. We removed the 24 mistranslated red examples. And now we want to look at 4 examples where vegetation definitions were given to Suph. And these fall in the 2 verses of Moses being in the basket in the Nile, and then a verse in Isaiah and a verse in Jonah. And these verses are Exodus 2:3, Moses' mother made a basket of bulrushes, put the child in it, placed it among the reeds, which is what you'll find in most Bibles. Reeds comes from Suph, at the river's brink. The other one is the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river and saw the basket among the reeds, Suph. One problem that I see immediately is that Suph is singular, and the translations make it plural, which doesn't correlate with the Hebrew. So the botanical reed idea hinges just on these 4 verses. Of all the other verses, Yam Suph, or all the other Suph words in the Suph family, there's just these 4 little verses that people use to derive the reed idea for Suph. And in fact, these are outliers. They don't coincide with the root verb meaning. And Gesenius' lexicon, a very well-known lexicon, said that the etymology of rush, reed, or seaweed is unknown and cannot be analytically derived. That's what I'm saying. You can't analytically derive this vegetation meaning for Suph. Better ideas, as I mentioned, would be end, conclusion, door, threshold, basin, bowl, sill, or gate. The idea of an end or a margin or a border. And so when you look at these two key verses in Exodus about Moses, and you look at the Septuagint Bible, instead of saying reeds, the Greek Bible uses the word elos, which can mean pool or ooze. And the idea here is that maybe the basket was placed in the edge of a pool, but not necessarily in vegetation. And so we have the idea of Suph, or another version, Suph, meaning edge or basin, which would be a better translation actually for this story about Moses' basket, that the basket was simply placed in the edge of a basin or the edge of a pool of water, and not that the Suph was vegetation. So reviewing, based on the promised land and Yam Suph being the boundary of the promised land, Suph would logically mean the end or boundary, and Yam Suph would be the sea of ending or boundary. And some people have noted, well, maybe it refers to the end of Pharaoh and the Egyptian army. Well, it certainly did, and that could be God's version of humor.
Yeah.
And so
it's funny. I was thinking that exact thing when you said. I was thinking, maybe it means the end of Pharaoh, but yeah.
So what I'm trying to say here is, without looking at all these other theories, I look first at the Bible. What is the word for the sea, and what does that word mean in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, and how does it apply geographically? And so I've come up with the idea that Yam Suph simply means the sea of ending or sea of boundary, most likely referring to the boundary or ending of the promised land.
Wow, that makes sense. It makes perfect sense.
And so we're stuck with this idea that if you have the Hebrew point of view, the Hebrew Bible point of view, then you're going to be looking at this body of water, the Gulf of Aqaba. You're going to be looking at this area, which is described as being adjacent to Yam Suph. And why would you be looking over here at the Gulf of Suez, or why would you be looking at these marshes or lakes near Egypt if this is what the Bible says? And so in my Lost Sea of the Exodus book, the first thing I had to do was lay out what the Hebrew Bible said about Yam Suph. But then I had to deal with the whole body of knowledge and hypotheses about the Reed Sea and the crossing being near Egypt and this marsh and shallow water and all of those, what I consider to be falsehoods, false traditions. So once you establish the truth, you still have to deal with the falsehoods that have overshadowed the truth for, in this case, a couple of thousand years.
So Glenn, at this point, are you going to get into some of the logistical issues of all the Israelites making it across the Sinai to the Gulf of Aqaba?
Yes, I'll be covering the travel route
okay.
in a few minutes here.
Sure.
And again, my slides are jumping ahead of me. I'm really
no worries.
For that. So the question comes up then, you have this Hebrew definition of Yam Suph being at the Gulf of Aqaba. Why is this Red Sea idea persisting? The idea that was launched by the Septuagint and then reinforced by Josephus, the historian. Why has this Red Sea idea persisted as being near Egypt? And what I realized is that when you look at old maps, they all show the Red Sea as a single shaft of water ending near Egypt, and they didn't show the Gulf of Aqaba. Here's a map from 1570. We have Egypt, the head of the Red Sea, Mount Sinai, and Aqaba over here. but we don't have a Gulf of Aqaba shown, and this was 1570. And so the issue is that if people are studying the Exodus and they don't see a Gulf of Aqaba on their maps, how can they even put it in their hypothesis as being part of the Exodus, as being the body of water that was crossed?
It's a good point.
And here's a map from 1700, I think very similar to the one you have on your wall, where we have this single shaft of water ending near Egypt, but there's no Gulf of Aqaba shown. This was 1700.
Wow.
And in reality, exploration of the head of the Gulf by a European didn't occur until the early 1800s. And the Gulf of Aqaba wasn't actually accurately mapped until about 1830. In essence, up to that point, people could not consider the Gulf of Aqaba as the site of the crossing because it didn't exist on their maps.
So they were looking, the reason why they were not looking is because geographically it wasn't even a candidate for them.
Exactly.
Got it.
So we have the obscurity of the Gulf of Aqaba as the explanation for it being missing from Exodus hypotheses for most of history. Now, what about the Red Sea? Reed Sea, how did that evolve? And because that seems to be the prominent idea now. The Reed Sea ideas project a crossing at some marsh or shallow lake in the vicinity of Egypt. And it's first based on what we talked about earlier, this outlier idea that Suph means weeds or rushes or reeds or papyrus. So that's the basic throwback on the idea of reed. And in fact, Reed Sea was a synonym for the Red Sea. It was in this map of around 1500. It shows the head of the Red Sea. This is Egypt up here. It shows the crossing site here. And this mention on the map says the Red Sea, in Hebrew called Yam Suph, that is to say the Sea of Reeds, from the multitude of reeds found floating thereon. And so we have to realize that originally Reed Sea was simply a synonym for the Red Sea in antiquity. And this idea was likely birthed by the mention of Red Sea vegetation, corals and whatnot by Diodorus, Pliny, and Strabo. And so the idea was locked into the literature that there was vegetation in the Red Sea. Now, if we look at how Bibles treat the idea of Suph, in the Septuagint, 250 BC, in the 4 vegetation verses, they translated the verses of Moses' basket being in the Nile as elos or ooze. The Septuagint writers had plenty of words for reeds or other vegetation if they wanted to use it in those verses. I've listed, I'm sorry, my slides are getting ahead of me again here. I've listed all the possibilities that the Greeks had, but they chose elos as their translation of Suph in the Moses in the Nile verses. They didn't call it a reed or a papyrus. But as we look later in biblical history, these are Bibles on the left. These are the dates from old to new. What I've noticed is that the idea of papyrus or vegetation became transmitted through the Bibles to where almost all the occurrences of Suph in these 4 verses had some type of vegetation definition. And the Luther Bible in particular popularized this by using the word Shilf for Suph in these 4 verses that we're talking about. And so the Luther Bible was the first Bible that was mass printed. And so it spread that idea that this Red Sea had something to do with reeds, with Shilf. So we're talking about the evolution of the Reed Sea theory. And what we saw was the assignment of the idea of reeds or vegetation to the Red Sea itself based on traditions of translation of Suph in the Bible. And then we saw that the Red Sea was the Reed Sea in antiquity. It didn't refer to these marshes or lakes near Egypt. Now, the first transition from the Gulf of Suez crossing that Josephus talked about was the inland sea theories. These theories developed in the time of the Suez Canal construction in the 1860s. The idea was that the Isthmus of Suez, here between the Gulf and the Mediterranean, had once been flooded, and that the crossing occurred on the isthmus itself. Part of the basis for this idea was people were seeking non-miraculous explanations for the crossing. So they needed to pull the crossing out of the sea and put it in shallow water, in this case, in the Isthmus of Suez. And here's an example from Neville in 1891, where he shows the Red Sea encroaching up all the way to Timza in the midpoint of the Isthmus of Suez. And then he puts the crossing over this inland Red Sea. And so you have to realize that the first efforts to reduce the miraculous nature of the sea crossing were to move it inland, not necessarily to call it a reed sea or to put it in marshes, but to move it inland into shallow water. Then the next step was to actually assign it to reedy or marshy areas based on the assumption that Suph meant reed or papyrus. And this idea of the Reed Sea theory originated from 2 Egyptologists, mainly Heinrich Brugsch in about 1880 and Alan Gardner in 1922. Essentially what these men did is they borrowed the Reed Sea from the Red Sea, they moved it to inland swamps, and they used linguistic speculation that the Hebrew word Suph had something to do with papyrus. And they also favored non-miraculous sea crossings. Now, what Brugsch did in his prototype Reed Sea theory is he moved the Sea of Reeds from the Gulf of Suez, he moved it up to Lake Serbonus here on the Mediterranean coast. So he took the idea that the Red Sea was the Reed Sea, but he moved that up to Lake Serbonus because he was looking for a place with reeds.
Oh, okay.
And what's really crazy about this, and realize this is a prototype. What's really crazy about this is that he launched his theory from a lexicon entry that the Hebrew word Suph, whose meaning of weeds, reeds, rushes, papyrus, is certified by the dictionaries of the Hebrew language, also gave its name to Yam Suph, the Sea of Reeds. Well, he ignored the lexicon of the day that said the etymology of Suph is rush, reed, seaweed, does not have a grammatical basis. So I have no idea where he got this idea of Suph meaning vegetation,
Huh.
and where it was certified by a dictionary. I have no idea where he got that, because the lexicon of the day said that there's no basis for it.
Wow.
What's even crazier still is in Brooks' writings, he chose Lake Serbonus because of Milton's Paradise Lost, where Milton described a gulf profound as that Serbonian bog where armies whole have sunk, referring, I guess, to the Persian army. And Brooks was musing about that legend when he was considering Lake Serbonus.
Wow.
And so here you have a guy that redefines the Red Sea, moves the Red Sea to Lake Serbonus, does so on the basis of Milton's Paradise Lost. And he was criticized in his day by people, but yet he planted an idea that sprung forth without any logical basis.
Wow.
So when we jump forward to Gardner in the 1920s, Alan Gardner, an Egyptologist, he envisioned a crossing at Lake Manzala in the northeast Nile Delta. And he did so on the idea that Suph was linked with the Egyptian Tufi, referring to a place of papyrus. There are geological problems with this idea of the marsh lakes in the Isthmus of Suez, because in antiquity, 1500 BC, these lakes didn't exist. For instance, Lake Tanis and the Bitter Lakes were created in the 1860s by the Suez Canal. Before that time, they didn't exist. And yet people use those lakes as sea sites for the Exodus as if they existed all through history. It doesn't add up.
Yeah.
Pliny in 75 AD recorded that the route from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea was 125 miles over desert sands. There's no mention of water in the isthmus in antiquity. In reality, it was an arid, waterless desert with no canal and no lakes. As far as the Lake Manzala of Gardner goes, it didn't exist at the time of the Exodus because the coastline was about 22 miles further inland. It hadn't been deposited yet by the Nile flooding.
Wow.
And the delta was about 54 feet higher and thus drier. The reason the delta was higher is that it has been subsiding due to underlying geological formations. So that at the time of the Exodus, the delta was small and it was high and dry. And so the likelihood of Lake Bala, Lake Manzala being places for an Exodus crossing are limited by the geological data.
Wow, fascinating.
And so what bothers me as a geographer with a geological background as well is how these people, the Egyptologists, can take a linguistic theory that Suph meant reed and therefore it should be in a marsh, and they automatically assign it to some wet area around Egypt, and they have no research into the historical geography of the area and the fact that it was probably didn't support the body of water that they're claiming was the Sea of Reeds.
Fascinating.
So the two main problems with the Reed Sea theory are the linguistics of it and the geological aspects of it, not to mention the disagreement with the Hebrew definition of Yam Suph being 150 miles east at the Gulf of Aqaba. And when people criticize my Gulf of Aqaba idea, it's not just mine, other people have that idea. I always direct them first to the Hebrew sources and the Hebrew geography. And they don't like to look at that. They like to look at what the Egyptologists say about the idea of reeds and a marsh and being close to Egypt. In reality, most of the reed sea theories are popular because they don't require a miraculous circumstance. People are trying to explain this without the miraculous, a little wind, a little tidal drift. And
yeah, and let me just insert at this point, and I completely 100% agree with you, Glenn. Not only that, the geological and the geographical problems, but also throughout the Old Testament, the crossing that God miraculously delivered the Israelites through this flood of water is the pivotal salvation event in the Old Testament. And the biblical writers, from the prophets to of course Moses, the prophets, the law, all look back to this event as the pivotal event in the entire Old Testament, as God's saving. In fact, when the Israelites finally go into the promised land, they cross the Jordan at a place called Beth Abira, which means house of the crossing, which is sort of a reiteration of God miraculously parting the Red Sea. And so you know, the biblical writers are praising this momentous event, and it just doesn't make sense if there was a marshy, little area that God sort of sent some wind to dry up. What the biblical writers are saying and what we actually read, or what we actually are hearing from some people, are completely two different things. So it's got to be a great momentous thing that God did, and the Sea of Reeds hypothesis doesn't make sense. I'll say one other quick thing here while we're on it. I do have some colleagues, very dear colleagues that I love and respect with the utmost, but I do disagree with them on this point, and they do hold to some of the theories that you're talking about. I don't think that they necessarily are discounting the miraculous, and I'll mention a couple of names here just so people will know who I'm talking about. Dr. James Hoffmeyer and also Dr. Bryant Wood, who I greatly respect. Dr. Wood actually excavated with Bryant Wood in Israel back in 2014. I helped excavate Khirbet El Maqader. I think Bryant Wood is one of the top evangelical archaeologists in the world. But Dr. Wood does hold that the crossing is somewhere, maybe Lake Bala, with James Hoffmeyer, and I just think there's some problems with that because when they crossed over, they were in Midian. In the Sinai Peninsula, to my understanding, and maybe you're going to get into this, Glenn, was never Midian. Midian is actually in modern Saudi Arabia.
That's correct. And one other minor point, one modern Egyptologist said, "Will you show me chariots in the Gulf of Aqaba and I'll believe your hypothesis?" Well, I might say to him, look at Lake Bala, which is now nothing but a sand pit. That would be a great area if there's thousands of chariots there.
Yes.
That would be a great area to excavate, and they would be very easily found there.
Great point, Glenn. That is an excellent point. Yes, very well preserved because of the dry climate.
Exactly. But to my knowledge, there's been no evidence of any type of army destruction in that area or any other area.
Great point. I'm sorry to interrupt, but continue on. Go ahead.
No, your comments are welcome. As I alluded to earlier, the Reed Sea idea is already is contradicted by the Septuagint, because in all of the opportunities that they had to call Yam Suph a sea of reeds or vegetation, they never did. They had all these words for vegetation, reed, reedy, things at their disposal, but they called it erythrithalassa. And in their geography, erythrithalassa, the Red Sea, was a true sea to the Greeks and the Romans. There was no question about its size and location to those ancients. And for them to assign the Red Sea name to Yam Suph and ignore all these vegetation terms, I think is highly significant. And Uh, I think the Egyptologists that look for locations near Egypt are overlooking what the Septuagint said in 250 BC.
Hmm.
So what about the journey from the Nile Delta? Some of the theories that place the sea crossing here near Egypt seem to bring the Hebrews along the coastline of the Mediterranean in order to encounter these marshy areas. But the Bible says that when Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that way was near. The Philistines were over here on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. And this Via Mara, or the Ways of Horus, was the coastline route that commerce and armies traveled for centuries. But God didn't take them on this coastal route.
Yeah.
It said that
interesting
God
when you,
let,
it's interesting when you just actually read the text itself. It gives you everything you need.
exactly. God led the people out of the land of Egypt by the way of the wilderness of Yam Suph. If our hypothesis is correct that Yam Suph refers to the Gulf of Aqaba, then the wilderness of Yam Suph has got to be some of this rough terrain in the vicinity of Yam Suph. Well, some people say the wilderness of Yam Suph went all the way back into the Sinai Peninsula. Well, that's possible, but the focus of the wilderness is Yam Suph, which would lead me to believe it's more on the eastern side of the Sinai Peninsula. And as you mentioned, the destination of the Hebrews was somewhere in the vicinity of Midian, which I place down here in the Arabian Peninsula. And the reason for that is when Moses was at the burning bush, God told him that the sign
That's right.
these things would be that he would bring them back here to this mountain to worship.
Exactly. Yep.
And
Exodus chapter 3.
yes, and we don't know that Mount Sinai was necessarily in Midian, but it appears it was within some proximity. And therefore Moses was intent on bringing them back to that mountain, which would require them to return back to the region of Midian, which would be on the eastern side of Yam Suph.
Yep.
And the only reason people have argued for a Midian in the Sinai Peninsula is to bolster their argument that Mount Sinai was in the Sinai Peninsula. There's no historical basis for putting Midian in the Sinai Peninsula. Now, I go into that in my Exodus Mysteries book. I don't go into it in the Lost Sea of the Exodus book, but you're correct in saying that Midian would have been here on the eastern shore of Yam Suph, the Gulf of Aqaba. And when we consider that the Exodus lasted 40 years, some people said, well, why didn't Moses just take the Israelites directly to the promised land? Well, that wasn't God's plan. As I mentioned, the first thing was to go back to the mountain to worship and actually to be schooled. And so the direction of travel would have been to this area of Arabia. The route that I laid out to get there follows the low-lying areas of the Sinai Peninsula. It doesn't follow the classic Hajj route between the heads of the Gulf, which is a high and dry route. It follows the low-lying areas where there'd be a greater chance of vegetation, water, and there are a lot of ephemeral streams, especially in the spring. There's rainfall that collects here, and so the route that I've laid out is about 277 miles, and I've made my destination of that route across the Sinai Peninsula, Nuweiba down here on the lower right. Nuweiba is a little town on a 8 square mile delta created by the Wadi Watur. A wadi is a Arab name for a stream.
Yeah, dry riverbeds, a seasonal dry riverbed that you can actually walk in when it's dry. Yeah.
Right. And so this is the destination that I've laid out in my mapping of the route across the Sinai Peninsula. Now, the reason that I favor the Nuweiba site is both sides of the Gulf have adequate space for a large number of people. The 2 million or more could easily congregate here on the delta at Nuweiba, and the shore on the far side is very large also. It's the only area in the Gulf where you find that space that's needed on both sides of the Gulf. In addition, the Gulf is very deep, and this is the only area where the slope of the seafloor would accommodate passage if the water was removed. I've shown some diagrams here of the bathymetry, the seafloor slopes at different areas in the Gulf, and the horizontal to vertical dimensions are not to scale, they're just diagrammatic. But you can see here at the Nuweiba area that the incline is relatively gradual, going up and down. Conversely, at some of these other potential areas, you have very steep inclines that would prohibit human navigation. There are some people that place the crossing here at the Straits of Tiran, but there are some very steep areas within that region that in my mind would prohibit a crossing if the water was removed. So from a bathymetry standpoint and from a shoreline standpoint, I favor Nuweiba. Now, the final point is that Nuweiba does have access to the interior of the Sinai Peninsula through the Wadi Watur. And that's the other key factor.
Right. And there's an interesting passage in Exodus 14. It says when they came to a place called Pihahiroth, of course, the armies of the pharaohs were behind them, and the water was in front of them. And so at the mouth of Wadi Watir, right there at Nuweiba, they would basically have been trapped, basically, because if the Pharaoh's armies were in the Wadi Watir behind them and the water's in front of them, there's nowhere else to go except across the sea. And that's where, of course, if this is where it happened, then God parted the Red Sea there at Nuweiba. Is that your theory?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. That's kind of where I am as well.
Now, I wanted to bring in one other point about the selection of the route. Orientalist Alois Musil, very well traveled, very well known, speculated that if the Israelites migrated from Egypt in the month of March, and if there had been an abundance of rain on the peninsula of Sinai that year, they would have found rain pools of various sizes in all of the cavities and all of the hollows of the various riverbeds, and they could have comfortably replenished their water bags and watered their flocks.
Wow.
So my idea is not necessarily original to myself, but as I evaluated the potential travel paths, this came to me as the most logical way to transport 1.5 million, 2 million people with thousands of head of cattle across a peninsula, because grazing access, water access would be very key to the survival.
Glenn, let me interject at this point and ask you how you'd respond to this, because some scholars have said that the Israelites could have traveled maybe on a good day because of all the people and families and their livestock could have traveled maybe 6 to 7 miles a day. And when you read the account of when they left versus when they arrived at Sinai, it was about 10 days. Have you worked the logistics out with this, and how do you answer some of the also geographical markers of some of the place names? It says it was X days journey to this, and so could the Israelites have traveled that far in 10 days, or is there something else going on?
The only chronological marker we're given is the arrival in the wilderness of Sin 30 days after leaving Egypt.
Okay.
So there's no other time frame involved in the biblical data. What my estimate is that the travel time between Egypt and the shore of the sea was about 19 or 20 days.
Okay.
Once they crossed the sea, it took them another 10 days to reach the wilderness of Sin.
Okay.
Accounting for the 30 days that the Bible tells us about. Now, there are traditions that the sea was reached in 3 days or it was reached in 7 days, but those are just traditions. If they traveled about 15 miles a day, they could reach the shore of Yam Suph at Nuweiba within 20 days, and realized that they were given light to travel at night with the pillar of fire. They were given cloud cover in the daytime to shield from the heat. And this huge mass of people probably covered 10, 12, 15, 20 miles long, a huge movement over a large area at one time. And there were always people resting, moving, stopping. And it was to travel 24 hours a day under those conditions when you had hardened slave labor people is not inconceivable to me. So
yeah,
I estimate about 15 miles a day on this route
okay,
for under 20 days.
And also one other quick question, based on this proposed route that you have, a route through the wilderness there or through the Sinai, potentially some archaeologists could survey this and perhaps find any kind of, do you think there would be any archaeological remains? And I know they're traveling, they're not, settling permanently in an area, but perhaps some pottery or some type of evidence. Again, you have to know exactly where to look. But do you think that there might be, are there any archaeological surveys or any, I know there's a lot of Bedouin in the area today.
As far as the Hebrews' travel went, I don't think they favored the use of any pottery because it's heavy and it's breakable.
Right.
I think they were using water bags, sacks.
Right.
Their animals were beasts of burden. Their tools were likely Stone Age tools, flints, stone hammers, things that would be hard to differentiate from those of other people groups.
Right. They did have some objects from Egypt, because the text does say that they left with treasure from Egypt, but that's another issue. We do find, I know that in at Khirbet el-Maqater in Israel, in the near the West Bank, we found several scarabs that date to the 18th dynasty of Egypt, very likely Tutmosis III or Amenhotep II. So these little scarabs they could have carried with them in their pocket, and perhaps one fell out, but that would be the only thing that you might find. But again, that you'd have to know exactly where to look. But anyway, I'm sorry to get off track here, but
oh, it's a great question, and I think most of what they used were natural items: leather, fiber,
got it.
bone, and
And one other thing, one objection that I've heard, not aimed at me directly, but someone asked, I forgot where it was online somewhere, maybe it was on our website, why don't we find any when we look down at some infrared photography of the route of the Sinai, do we find any evidence of a massive migration of people? And my response would be that we know that Genghis Khan during the 12th and 13th century, there were hundreds of thousands of Mongolian hordes, and yet we also don't see evidence of them as well. But we know they existed from historical sources. So it's not out of the ordinary that we don't find this. But it's a desert environment as well, and the landscape is continually changing.
Exactly. Well, with your infrared satellite imagery, it's mainly designed to show vegetation, chlorophyll,
Right.
and to determine some type of a track laid down 3,400 years ago, when, as you said, there's been weathering, hundreds of thousands of other people perhaps covering the same areas since. It's not the right type of study to rely on.
Right.
Now I want to get to the topic of Etham or Edom on the route. Exodus 13:20 says, so they took their journey from Sukkoth and camped in Etham at the edge of the wilderness. When it says edge of the wilderness, it could refer to the wilderness of Yam Suph, because that was the destination that was stated earlier when they left Egypt. It could be the edge of a generic wilderness. It could be the edge of the wilderness of Etham, Edom. And the Edom idea is interesting because once they crossed the sea, then they spent 3 days in the wilderness of Edom, also called the wilderness of Shur. And so the questions come up, well, how can you have Edom on both sides of the sea? And so we want to talk about Edom for a minute here. If you think about the journey, Moses was trying to take the Hebrews around the head of the Gulf back to Midian. And to do that, you have to cross in an area that's convenient to travel to get to the head of the Gulf. And you mentioned archaeology. In this area where I place Edom, there are a lot of Bronze Age and Chalcolithic sites that exist here. Now these data, I don't think apply to the Exodus. I think they're from times before the Exodus.
Right, okay.
But what this points out is that this area of Edom, the encampment of Edom, was a desirable place to camp for hundreds and thousands of years by thousands of people. And essentially it was a stopping point before one made the steep descent to the sea level of the Gulf. You were on a plateau in the area of Edom, and the next stage would be go through the rough terrain downhill to what would be modern Eilat at the head of the Gulf. So this just shows that the area that I propose as Edom was also a popular stopping place for thousands of people through the years. This area communicates with the entrance to Wadi Watur, where I estimate the sea crossing began. So this is just an archaeological sidelight.
Interesting.
And as I mentioned, Moses' idea would have been to go around the head of the Gulf of Aqaba on down into Midian. This dotted path is the Hajj route, which wasn't developed till around 700 AD, but this would have generally been the route that Moses anticipated taking. He didn't anticipate having to deal with a sea or a sea crossing. Now, the idea of Edom actually can be seen in the Coptic Egyptian. Adiom has a similar spelling pronunciation, means the boundary of the sea. And also the Arabic Et-Tahama or Tama refers to the coastal zone of the Red Sea in Northwest Arabia. And so I think there's some linguistic linkages between the idea of Edom, the Coptic Egyptian Adiom, and the Arabic Et-Tihama or Tama. I think essentially Edom refers to the border of the sea, the lands, the wilderness around the sea, the coastal plains, as well as the mountainous parts of those plains. Mm-hmm. And so this would explain why we can see the idea of Edom on one side of the sea, and then after they cross, the wilderness of Edom on the other side, because it was simply referring to the coastal region around this body of water. So while they were at Edom, God instructed Moses to turn and encamp before Pihahiroth between Migdol and the sea. The word, Hebrew word shuv, is meaning turn, is to turn sharply. And so we have Edom here, and I'm projecting a turn to the south. And I'll explain why to the south in just a minute.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you that. Why you had mentioned earlier Moses' intention was to go around the northern tip, but why did he go south? But go ahead, continue.
Well, God told him to encamp before Pihahiroth, and Pihahiroth was between Migdol and the sea. And Pihahiroth was over against Baalzephon, meaning it faced Baalzephon. So we have to explain these terms: Pihahiroth, Baalzephon, Migdol, and Pihahiroth means the mouth of the caves, or mouth of the holes. Pe is mouth in Hebrew, ha means the, and hirot is plural for caves. Now in Hebrew, pe, mouth, is the intake point of a sack, for instance, not the outflow point. When we talk about exploring rivers in modern day idiom, we talk about entering the mouth of the river. Well, the mouth of the river in our idiom is the outflow point. But you don't see that used, you don't see the mouth of the river idea used in the Hebrew Bible. So Pe is talking about the entrance, not the exit point of this cave-like structure.
Ah, fascinating. Yeah. I had never, that's new for me. I had not heard that before.
And what some commentators say is that Pihahiroth was at the beach. Well, that would be at the outlet of the water.
Ah, wow. Okay.
Not the inlet.
That makes perfect sense. Yes. Now,
there's verification in Numbers 33:8. It says they departed from before, or facing Hahiroth, and passed through the midst of the sea into the wilderness. So when they left the beachhead, they didn't leave the mouth, they just left the caves because the mouth wasn't there.
Ah, yes, yes.
And there are some Bibles that will have Pihahiroth in this verse, but there are many others in the original languages that don't have the Pe. So to me, the fact that Hahiroth appears by itself in many texts tells me that the Pe is not associated with the exit point. It's not associated with the beachhead. And so when the Lord is telling Moses to turn toward Pihahiroth, he's telling him to turn towards the entrance, the intake point of this cave-like structure, Pihahiroth. Now, Pihahiroth occurs 3 times, and in the 3 verses it occurs, it always faces Baalzephon. So we have to understand what Baalzephon is. Pihahiroth faces Baalzephon. In antiquity, Baalzephon was the Canaanite and Phoenician god. It means Lord of the North or owner of the North. He was a storm god, protector of mariners. And the location of the abode of Baalzephon was at modern Jebel Akra, here at the border between Syria and Turkey. It's shown here. Now, Akra comes from the Greek word for point, so it's a modern term. But at this mountain, also called Cassius of Zeus by the Greeks, there's a lot of archaeological finds related to worship of Baalzephon, particularly at Ugarit, which is Ras Shamra,
Yep.
To the south of Jebel Akra. A lot of documents were found here.
Yep, that's right.
To
the Veil cycle, the complete Ugaritic library was found there.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what God is telling Moses is that Pihahiroth faces far north. It faces directly north. And in Moses' mind and minds of the ancient, the most northern point they could probably think about was Baalzephon, this Jebel Akra area. And so
it could also, couldn't it also be an anachronism as well of latter biblical writers who knew about the Canaanite area of Baalzephon? I mean, I'm not, you know, I just don't know how would Moses have known, because the Canaanites were, I mean, I'm not sure where that dates to, but I see what you're saying, and it makes perfect sense. The fact that geographically they would have been able to navigate, oh, this area points due north, which makes perfect sense. So yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just thinking out loud.
Think about this. When Abraham migrated south to Canaan, this activity with Baalzephon was already going on. The apex of its worship was 1500 BC, but it had been going on long before that.
Okay.
And being associated with a geographical landmark, I'm sure that Abraham and people of his era were aware of the existence of that landmark and that particular worship. So that was likely passed on through the patriarchs. But Zephon itself is used 153 times in the Old Testament, and it always refers to north. And adding the Baal simply adds a more distinctive identification of the landmark. And to Moses, it just would have meant somewhere far to the north. So in other words, Pihahiroth faced Baalzephon, it faced north.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Simple as that. So if I place Pihahiroth at the entrance to the Wadi Watur, which is about 30 miles south of Etham. The reason I put it there is there are two wadis that coalesce here that funnel one into the Wadi Watur. And shortly after funneling in at that point, the walls of the wadi become so steep that you can't escape. And so this would be the entry point, the mouth of the caves, the Pihahiroth, which faced north, faced Baalzephon. And this dotted line shows the actual direction up to Baalzephon.
Cool. This is so awesome.
So the key point again is that this is the opening, the entry point of the caves, and this entry point faced north. And that gave Moses the instructions he needed to move towards this area and know what he was looking for. Pihahiroth is spoken of as being between Migdol and the sea. In my mind, the sea and Migdol were geographical counterparts of similar magnitude. The southern Sinai Peninsula has this huge mountainous massif, that is extremely visible from long distances. And in Moses crossing the Sinai on the north would have had this massif on his right shoulder the whole time. He would have been cognizant of it. In Hebrew, Migdol simply means tower. So you have a towering massif, and you have the sea. The Hebrews camp between Migdol and the sea, between the tower and the sea.
Yes.
And it's a very general description, but Moses used large general landmarks.
Yeah.
Now, the people that want to place the sea crossing at a marsh near Egypt have to create man-made objects. They have to create a man-made tower called Migdol. They have to create a man-made Baalzephon.
Yeah.
And in my mind, these are large landmarks, very simple descriptions.
Right. And it just makes perfect sense that Moses would use these simple landmarks because of course he was a shepherd. And you know, when you're out in the wilderness, and you know this, I was a survival instructor in the U.S. Air Force many years ago, and one of the things we taught was combat land navigation. And we taught also how to triangulate, and by using geographical landmarks. And so when you're out in the wilderness, you can't be specific about, they didn't have GPS, but they could point to a mountain and go, oh, this tower right here, in between this tower and in between the sea, you go north or you go south. So it just simplifies things much better when you're navigating in a really remote area.
You're exactly right. Summarizing this idea, the encampment at Etham would be here. Then they would move south to Pihahiroth into the Wadi Watur and wind up at the Nuweiba Delta. Etham referred to the area around the Gulf itself, the coastal plains, and the wilderness of Etham would have been the mountainous part of the coastal plains. And so when they camped at Etham, they camped near the wilderness of Etham, or near the plain of the sea. And when they crossed, they entered into the wilderness of Etham. And it all boils down to just a simple description of the seashore. And this has confused a number of Exodus authorities, because they say, well, how can they leave Etham and then go back into Etham again? So it's been a confusing point, but if you understand that it's simply a term for this shoreline around the body of water, it adds up.
Makes perfect sense, yeah.
And so this encampment at the sea was between Migdol and the sea.
So cool.
What this image is meant to show you is that the sea is very deep off of Nuweiba, 850 meters, about 2,800 feet deep. It's about almost 10 miles wide. There is no land bridge here. The people say, well, there was a land bridge. No, it's a flat, wide area, but it's very deep. And the removal of the water from this area would create massive atmospheric changes with the inrush of air. It would also unload the geological structures at the bottom of the sea, removing that weight of water, creating seismic activity. And so the seafloor actually may have been somewhat different for the crossing, because the seafloor of the Gulf of Aqaba has several kilometers of sediment above the bedrock. The seafloor itself is not the bedrock. There's kilometers of sediment on top. And so if you unload that sediment by removing the water suddenly, you're going to have some uplifting of that sediment and perhaps modulation of the slopes and the depths. Now, I'm not saying that it decreased the depth by any significant amount, but I'm just saying that there were things at play that did modulate the seafloor conditions, maybe from what we see today.
Got it.
Now, the Bible and Josephus both describe thunder, lightning, storms, atmospheric activity. The Bible talks about the seismic activity in 2 different Psalm verses. So this was a very dramatic event with hundreds of square cubic kilometers of water being removed. And I'm sure it was terrifying for all involved. And people say, well, it's just too deep for a miracle. It can't happen here. And they want to go back to Egypt to where it's shallow. But that's the same thing that Moses dealt with, that Moses is on the shore with the Hebrews, and they say, take us back to Egypt. We don't want to die here.
Yeah.
We want to go back to our leeks and onions and
love it.
And so they didn't have any faith. And so you have skeptics today standing on the seashore at Nuweiba and saying it's too wide, it's too deep. Take us back to the shallow water in Egypt.
Oh, I love it. So is there any, do you have any kind of proposals, theories, hypotheses about what may have caused? Was it an earthquake? Was it geological activity? Any ideas on what could have pushed the water back? And we know that God did it, but are there any perhaps natural things that God used to do this?
I think it was strictly supernatural. Now, there is a verse that talks about wind.
Yeah.
And people have tried to do engineering studies about wind set down theories and whatnot. The problem with that is that the amount of wind that would move a significant amount of water would also prohibit travel.
Right.
And so that's kind of a waste of time.
Right.
And it's especially a waste of time if you consider the Hebrew grammar of that verse. The Hebrew grammar says that the wind accompanied the phenomena, but it did not cause it.
Wow.
There's a little preposition by.
I love
it's one word, letter B in Hebrew. And the wind was not an instrument. It was an accompaniment.
Right.
According to that preposition.
Glenn, I love this. This is fantastic. And we got to remember, folks, this is a miracle. I mean, we can study geography, we can study archaeology, we can study the history of this, and we can look at them, which Glenn and I have been looking at, the proposed Exodus route. But at the end of the day, what God did was a miracle. And now archaeology, it's not in the tool belt of archaeology to study miracles, but what we can study is the historical data of the text, and we can see if the historical data matches geographical place names, things like that. But what we get with miracles is we've talked about this before in epic archaeology. We believe there are good arguments that God exists, that God does miracles, that if the universe is open, then miracles are possible. And the miracle of the Red Sea crossing was just that. It was a miracle. But where did it happen? This very well may be the likely spot where that great miracle happened. So, Glenn, we only have a few minutes left, and perhaps you can we can sort of continue on here, but just a couple minutes left and sort of tie a bow on this. Man, I wish we could just talk for hours on this. It's just completely fascinating.
Well, this diagram just explains what I was saying earlier about the slopes at the Nuweiba crossing. And for instance, the 6-degree average downhill slope is about the slope of an interstate highway.
Wow.
Or 7.4 degree uphill slope.
So easy for a group of people to walk down, not strenuous at all.
Right. Now, another factor about the wind is it says that the wind was a forward wind, kadima in Hebrew. Well, most of the time when you see the word kadima, you call it an east wind. But it's my suspicion that the wind blew forward, and the wind actually helped blow them up the slope on the far side of the crossing.
Oh, wow.
There's no way, of course, I can prove that, but I just suspect that the wind was blowing forward and actually assisted their ascent in the crossing. And so when you talk about Yam Suph and how it's described in the Bible, there are many places that talk about its depths, its waves, how the soldiers sunk like stones. And you can't talk about it as though it's a shallow marsh. It was a violent sea-like structure that's described in numerous places in the Bible. And my takeaway is that when people read the Bible and they see some of these strange terms that Moses used, that we can associate those places with real positions on the earth.
Right.
That Moses was one of the most geographical writers up until the time of the Greeks and the Romans, and mentioned hundreds of different locations. And being able to identify and make sense of some of these names and places and put them together, link them together with a route, should reassure us that the Bible has a coherent message, and it was written by an eyewitness. The Torah was written by Moses, an eyewitness.
That's right.
And
If you would stop your share screen, that way we can kind of wrap this up. Thank you. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, there we go. So
okay.
yeah, you were saying, Glenn, that's exactly right. It was written by an eyewitness, but continue on.
Yeah, I think the important point is that Moses was an eyewitness. He wrote real geography. We can find many of those places, and we can link those places with the travels of the Hebrews in the Exodus. And if the Torah was just a combination of late writers later in history who didn't know about these places, didn't know the meaning of the names, just cobbled together stories and called it the Torah, then this wouldn't make sense.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. Well, Glenn, I cannot thank you enough for your encyclopedic information on this subject, and you are a blessing to the church, and I'm just blown away by the amount of research. And if people want to check out your research, they can go to your website, which is ancientexodus.com. And then also check out your two books. So you can get them on Amazon, and I think you can also get them on your website, right, Glenn?
Yeah, they're signed if they get them on my website.
Oh, fantastic. So Lost Sea of the Exodus, a modern geographical analysis, and then also the Exodus mysteries of Midian, Sinai, and Jabal al-Lawz. And so check that out on Amazon. You can also purchase those on his website. But Glenn, thank you so much for this fantastic information. And now, do you have any plans on doing any further research on this subject to see if some of your theories are right on target? Which I think they're pretty right on target, personally.
Well, I think I've written all the books I'm going to write.
That's quite a work, isn't it? I know.
Yes, it's a sacrifice, but it's been a blessing too.
Well, thank you. Any concluding thoughts on it? I know that you've said quite a lot, and I think toward the end you said that Moses was an eyewitness to these things, and he's writing about real events. He's writing about actual events. I go back to a passage in the New Testament where Jesus, in Luke chapter 16, he's talking to the rich man and Lazarus, and at one point. Basically, Jesus says through the story, if they would not believe Moses and the prophets, they would not believe the one rise from the dead.
Exactly.
So I think that Christians today have an option to trust what Moses is saying. Jesus placed a high value on the Torah, and I think that we shouldn't do any different, that we should place a high value on what God's word says. But that being said, at Epic Archaeology, we like to show how history and geography and archaeology actually dovetail hand in glove with what the biblical writer is saying. They're not making things up. They're not inventing things. They were eyewitnesses to these things. Again, it's one thing to say you're an eyewitness, but it's another thing to actually go and investigate these things. And Glen, you have spent 2 decades at least studying the issue of the geography of the Exodus. So also, not only do I want to recommend Glen's books on this subject, but also please check out, if you have not done so already, the documentary Patterns of Evidence. There are now multiple episodes, and I think, Glen, you are on the latest episode, correct?
The Red Sea Miracle 1 and the Red Sea Miracle 2.
Okay, so it's in 2 parts, correct?
Yes, and I also have a lecture series now on patterns of evidence about the Red Sea crossing.
Fantastic, excellent. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you guys for watching Monocle and Spade, listening on iTunes, and thank you for your patience. We've been trying to we record this on Zoom, and then we've been having I personally have been having trouble getting this uploaded, but I've got some help now. We're going to be getting this across all the podcast platforms, so SoundCloud, iTunes, and all your favorite podcast sources. So we're going to be having all of the Monocle and Spade podcast on the podcast platform. So please check those out, share them with your friends. We are on one of the very few podcasts that deal specifically with biblical archaeology. So we're happy to be in that little spot. But if you are watching this on YouTube, please hit subscribe and like, and please put any comments or questions you have in the comment section. We appreciate your feedback. But again, thank you guys for watching and listening to Monocle and Spade, the podcast of Epic Archaeology. I'm your host, Ted Wright, and I want to thank Glen Fritz, Dr. Glen Fritz, once more for coming on and talking about the route of the Exodus. God bless you. I hope you guys have a great day.